two broad issues. So firstly, this interpretational question about the debate, and secondly, some of the things that were discussed in the debate. So ignoring this whole fact policy, look at the board, what Danny thought it was, I think the issue that we all agree with is that the debate from the get-go sounds to be a lot about implications of this Treaty of Paris agreement, what will happen to climate change, the pragmatic situations of what's happening. Noticing I'm not using any phrases like solvency or plan. And so, when we hear that global warming is a threat right now, we need to do something to address it, binding agreements are the only way that works. It seems that the debate then, in the first speech from the proposition, is characterized as something that's about who's going to solve climate change, why is that comparatively better, what are the implications of this policy. And I think if you wanted to have a debate about something regret being about a value or a factor, not about a policy, I think that needed to be set up a lot clearly in the first speech, so that way it characterized the rest of the debate. Because the other thing is that even though in the second, third, and reply speeches you say that it's not just about policies, it's about what we regret, you're still, the debate is happening on their turf, that you're engaging all of the responses they're making about whether these binding agreements work, and you're not really giving us argumentation that is distinct and seems to follow under your interpretation of the debate. We get hints of it when you say, we cause it, so we therefore have to fix it, but no real substantial material explaining why that's the case. And at that point, because you're discussing this for so much, it decides a lot of the round. But in terms of the round, about binding versus non-binding, I think there are two general issues that explain why we think the opposition's material is a bit stronger on this point. First, I think, though both teams need to work on this, the opposition's explanation of the mechanism for both binding and non-binding agreements was comparatively better, we thought. So the proposition tells us that these agreements, when they're non-binding, are just palliative, that we do things to feel better but don't actually fix things. But I think the opposition gives us a more nuanced account that it's not just about whether we feel good about climate change being solved, but there are specific things that can happen, like international discussion about the issue, reaching a consensus, international peer pressure, that even if we're not getting drastic reductions in carbon emissions, we're at least moving in the right direction, which I think becomes comparatively problematic when they say that your agreements aren't likely to get things, because even if you were able to enforce them, there's an issue of whether people agree to them, and further, if they agree to them, whether they'll just pull out. And that's why I think the example of Canada and how once the Kyoto Protocol got too hard to follow, it just exited the agreement, becomes a bit damaging to your side. So what you say in response is that, well, China's pushing for the binding emissions targets and also Montreal work. I think that part of this is something, it's too reliant on individual examples without explaining what we should learn from those examples or conclude for those examples to engage the mechanisms they're giving us. And I think that's ultimately because ultimately we don't know if China specifically said these things in this agreement. It also seems just a little bit counterintuitive because China is the world's biggest polluter, and it was a very big deal for it to just agree in the Specificity agreement to cap its emissions at 2030 before even reducing them. That I think you need to give us some more explanation for why we're able to have these binding agreements. And I think the second thing is just that a lot of the proposition material ends up being defensive by the end of the round, that we're never getting any reasons why these legally binding agreements are proactively good or get some proactive benefit, but rather why just like some of these arguments about not signing isn't enough, or why the opposition doesn't do that. So that's ultimately how we reached the decision. In terms of holistic comments about what happened in the round and what I think could be better. So the first thing, because this is what everyone spent, granted, too much time on, is analyzing emotion. So just first things you need to ask yourself, what does it mean to regret something, which I think everyone discusses. But I think secondly, what are you specifically regretting? Because I do think there's somewhat of a difference between regretting something like a portrayal of women and regretting the lack of a policy in the motion. So like this, even though this motion is set up as this House regrets, motion, it sounds and seems to indicate a very different debate from the motion last round that you were referencing. So analyzing the motion in its entirety as opposed to just the first three words. So for instance, I once debated a motion like this House regrets the expansion of the European Union in 2004 or something. Like that seems to indicate a very different debate from like this House regrets the rise of far So just considering everything. And from that, what are each side's burdens? But I think another thing is that when it is a regret motion, but regrets in the context of a specific policy or something that specifically happened, one thing I think the proposition team needs to do is that this is basically like, we're regretting why the status quo is the way it is, that there's some problem with the status quo and we wish things were different, which means I think a lot of your argumentation needs to be directly geared towards why there is a failure in the status quo that we need to address and why that's necessarily the case. I'll explain a little bit more on that later as well. Second thing I think the debate needed is a lot more specificity to the Paris Climate Agreement. One thing all the judges said is that we felt the debate turned into legally binding versus non-legally binding enforcement mechanisms in a debate about the abstract, whereas this is specific about what this agreement should have entailed. So part of this is an impromptu motion, so you don't have the same opportunity to do specific research, but also keep in mind that this is like a huge global political event. So granted, you weren't preparing for your World's Invitational in December, but when you are preparing for it in July, keep in mind, like any major event like this, you should know almost like as much about it as possible. So things that are good to mention are the history of agreements. So Montreal and the CFCs you were talking about is a good example to bring up. But also being able to have fluency with the example to know why things are different. So the instance with those that it's about the chemicals your refrigerator emits, but at that time there was already technology that was pretty cheaply available to avoid emitting CFCs. So one reason the agreement was successful is that it was easier for developing countries to adopt that technology. One concern with climate change is that they don't yet have the solar and renewable energy infrastructure to make the drastic costs. So being able to not let them throw around those examples and apply them. The next example is Kyoto. Attempt to have a binding agreement, massive failure. Seems to be good for your side. You guys need to be prepared to explain why this could be different. Something that neither side really talked about that you could mention is Copenhagen in 2009 was an attempt again at having an international agreement that didn't end up having, didn't really do anything. And part of it's because this attempt to have a binding issue. And part of the reason a lot of these agreements are failing is something that only comes out at the tail end of the second speech from the opposition, but should be a major part of this debate is what is the responsibility of developing countries in combating climate change? Because right now they're emitting a lot more because their economies are emerging, but at the same time they don't have the resources to produce climate change. Is it just a restorative question? Is it do we need to just stop the world from dealing with this issue? And then there's the issue of Paris, which happened about a month ago. I think, so knowing the history of the debate, we contextualize it. Also knowing specifics in the agreement, so being able to refer to things like the U.S. Clean Power Plan, which is basically how the U.S. is going to meet the agreement, or knowing and referencing the fact, because you're talking about China, that China just agreed to cap its emissions at 2030. Is that a big enough commitment? Or countries like the EU doing massive things like 40% cutting emissions, or India and its massive solar panel. It would invest massively in solar technology. All of these are things that you can mention to bolster your arguments, whether for why they work or why they're insufficient. And then specifically tying all of that argumentation to the specifics about Paris climate. Like, not just why vague environmental treaty needs to be binding, but why Paris needed to be binding. And I think huge potential for this is, it is 2015, like, we should have done this 15 years ago. This is our only chance. When they say, and you sort of say this, but like really hammering home on this, when they say, oh, this can get us to a legally binding agreement in the future, that doesn't matter if we get that in 2100 when the world is underwater. Like that is what we, I think, can be helpful. Third thing I think all the teams could do a little bit of a better job on is warranting your arguments. So, and I mentioned this in the decision, this did come into play, that it's not just giving examples, but also explaining the mechanism by which this happens. So not just, oh, Montreal worked, but why it must necessarily be the case that that happened, and why it's likely to happen in other instances. And the advantage to that is even if the judge doesn't know whether you're true, or the judges don't know whether your example is true or not, they can believe the analysis that makes the example believable, and that should complement each other. That it should never be just examples or just analysis, but you should be able to talk about these issues fluently so they go back and forth. One way you could potentially do that, and we get an instance of this from the opening to the second opposition speaker about the analogy about whether you want fries and dieting, is telling a story to portray what actually happens and walking through the events. I think you can also do, it doesn't just have to be a personal analogies, it can also be about countries. So for instance, and people start to do this, but like China doesn't know whether its economy is going to grow or not, and as a authoritarian regime, the only way it maintains political legitimacy is by promising continuous economic growth. Therefore, if it finds out that it's not able to meet emissions, it might want to take the risk of signing a binding agreement, because then that might force it to accept economic damage that it cannot justify to its regime. Like fully fleshing out this story can help the judge believe the example, which is developing countries like China will not sign these agreements otherwise, and fully explaining the mechanism by telling us about the specific actors involved, what their incentives are, and how we do that. And then I think just contextualizing the debate more with history, with explanation of what's currently fourth thing I think you can work on a little bit is unity and fully fleshing out your argumentation. So all arguments need a clear structure, and you need to indicate where you're going. So I think an example of this is with the first proposition argument that you're all referencing. It's unclear where you're going because you're telling me climate change is really bad, but I don't understand why that concludes that or proposed the motion. And specifically, I'm confused because it's unclear whether you're making an argument like, this is so bad right now that we need to do absolutely everything, or what it sort of morphs into at times during the second and third speeches, never consistently. This is a principled reason why we need to accept this. I think one thing that you can do is say, like, this means we propose or support the motion specifically for a principled reason, which is that blah, blah, blah. Or this means we need legally binding agreements because they're the only way to reduce climate change, blah, 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 blah. Fifth thing, and this is a big one, diversity in offensive argumentation. So the entire debate comes down to whether binding or non-binding agreements will solve climate change. Granted, that is the most obvious and probably the most important issue in this debate, but is by no means the only issue. So definitely there's a principled element in this debate, like, is there some reason we should try to have legally binding enforcement mechanisms regardless of whether they fix the problem, because they're addressing some type of injustice, etc. That's one area that can be explored. Another area that's addressed upon, but should be like substantial, like at least 2 more minutes on this, maybe even more, is the role of developing countries in this. And not just from its Western imperialism, but also their pragmatic impacts. Like, are they going to sign agreements? Is it going to cost a lot of money? Is it going to ravage their economies? Is it going to mean they can't solve poverty because in like ex-developing country that relies on mining, there's a lot of emissions from that, and they're not able to do that anymore if they sign this agreement, or if they get sanctioned because they don't have solar technology. All of these are pragmatic things that seem to have impacts that are also relevant in addition to climate change. International political issues, etc. Because the round shouldn't just come down to whether I think they were giving slightly better analysis on one very specific issue about the enforcement mechanism of a non-binding agreement. And this is also just like, this is the only like technical thing I'm going to say, but like, think about the abstract, if you're going to think about solvency deficits, think about a 1 in C that is an advantage counterplan and 7 minutes of solvency deficits of the plan. Like, you want like independent disadvantages explaining why there's a problem. Sixth thing, analyze the comparative. I think every argument needs to consider there are 2 sides in this debate. There is this world where we like, and I agree, this motion is not requiring you to say, plan, the agreement should have done X, or model, which is what you should have referred to it as. The agreement should have done this, this, and this. But there should be some indication like, this world would look differently, and here's like a rough estimation of what that would be. Why is that necessarily better than what the world currently is, the current Paris Agreement climate we have? And every argument needs to explain, like for instance, innovation. You need to say, if we did things differently, we'd have innovation because of these reasons. The current agreement necessarily can't get innovation for those reasons. And directly comparing between the two is important. I think one thing that the Harvard team that recently won Worlds was very good at, specifically their second speaker, is that anytime he would give a speech, especially on, and to give you like, motions like these that seem to propose something that's a little bit vague or a little bit unrealistic or a little bit apolitical, is they're very specific in being comparative to the status quo and why there's a failure in the status quo. So like you said, for instance, the final motion was the global poor should engage in Marxist revolution. He's very specific, like, the current status quo of capitalism is failing, and that's necessarily the case. And what the op is going to try to tell you about reform doesn't happen because the poor necessarily disenfranchised for these reasons, and he explains why that's the case, which means nothing in their world can ever solve because of the fact that there's this structural problem. So you guys want to do something similar on this motion, honestly, almost any motion that's about fixing a problem, which is that necessarily their side and the trajectory that their side is going to go on cannot fix the problem regardless of what they say. And being comparative to that then frames the debate everything in your favor. And then the seventh thing is just you guys need to be a lot less American. And we're not sure like if this is because like we're all three American judges and like we know what you're talking about, but like, and this will go into specifics, like offenses include like framing a speech with like break impact, extinction impact, like 9 solvency deficits. They needed a plan, turn, topicality, like all of these are things that you should not be saying. Because the representation of American debaters is that it's cheap shot debate that isn't fully fleshed out, and that you don't fully discuss these arguments, you just go flip, and then if you guys like play into that, it makes it easy for judges to give you less credit than you deserve because they're like, oh, they were too American, they didn't make real arguments. Because there definitely were real arguments, but it was framed like you had to peel back the layer and the opening to each speech that was like topicality, value fact, solvency deficit. Specific comments, almost. I like the introduction, and I think you have a good speaking tone. I think in terms of the speech itself, the core thing you need to define is the burden for your side and what you need to do to win, especially on something like regret. So maybe you don't need to show a plan, but you do need to show like X, Y, Z kind of thing. Then in terms of the argumentation, I think if your first argument is just climate change bad, then I think they're right that they like co-opt that. Like that's not a reason to vote. If it's that there's something about the nature of climate change that gives us a principled reason to have legally binding enforcement mechanisms, regardless of whether they fix the problem. I think you need to say in concluding the argument exactly that. Like it does not matter whether they solve. And this is something that the Harvard team I referred to did very well, that anytime they're making a principled argument, they necessarily said it's not about whether we fix the problem or the pragmatic consequences, that there is an obligation to do this. There is a principle in this. And that needs to be front and center as opposed to like wedged in the middle of refutation. Because that is the only way, because there is definitely a bias in favor of utilitarian consequences in the world circuits, but the only way to counteract that is to be exceptionally clear about your argumentation.
On that,
yeah.
What I know we were going for was basically saying, just like you said, you should have taken action 15 years ago. Now it's sort of the last chance to preempt what they're going to go and say about discourse and maybe taking action later. What do you think could have been done so that came out more in that argument?
Then I would frame that as a second argument in the so I think there definitely should be a principled argument because there's definitely like something to be said there, and that's just one additional warrant for a reason why you best solve climate change. So I don't think the argument should be like finding agreements work. I think the argument should be phrased around an outcome you want to achieve and specific ways you get to that outcome. And one is that this is our last chance to do something. Another is that you can pull out of agreements. Otherwise, maybe a third is there's an incentive for innovation, etc. But reasons why this is X desirable outcome we want, here are like a couple of reasons we get that, and they're fully fleshed out.
Okay.
And then I think should save more time for the second argument because it's very important in this debate about whether they work. And not just explaining the Montreal ban, but what we can extrapolate from that example. Second speech. So, Nick, I think you have the right idea and the right strategy. You just need to, and I thought your speech was very good, but you need to take away the American aspect. So, like, first of all, I'm not going to go through all 9 solvency deficits, but I think some of them are probably repetitive or at least can be grouped together. So you can have 3, maybe 5 if you want to be excessive, but definitely enough. 9. Because especially like some of the things you say are just countries don't have technology, but like that needs to be like fleshed out a lot. So you're not giving the perspective I do think that is the right approach, explaining they're not fixing the problem when they set it up as a problem they need to solve. I think both arguments are good about why they won't sign the agreements and why non-binding agreements work better. I think what I said in general comments fully fleshing out the mechanisms, but also just be careful because a lot of the arguments you're referring to are just repetitions of some of the things you said in the solvency deficit section. And that's one thing that when I flow, and I'm never exactly sure how to flow international formats, but the way I've decided on is I just start writing at the top of my paper and go down to the bottom of the column. There's no left-right interaction, which means you don't need to say something again and again and again on each part of the line by line. You just need to say it once to make sure it's important. And that'll also save you a lot of time to expand on certain arguments and increase the ranking. That's what I have to second speech. So I think one thing is that even when there's a disagreement about what the motion is, there's a big bias against around turning into functionally a totality debate that even if you need to discuss it, you don't want it to be the thing that frames your speech, and this is true for every other speaker that follows. But rather it's you want to address this argument almost in a hidden manner. So maybe it's I'm going to explain why necessarily, even under their interpretation of the motion, they're wrong, then I'm going to explain why under a preferable conception, comparatively better. Or you don't even ever directly say, I'm challenging the motion, but you refer to the arguments you made that were acceptable under your side of the motion, and in explaining why it can come first, you're making motional, or topical, motion-based appeals. In explaining why, X principled argument that should have been made, you say that, and this is the most important argument because it directly answers the question of whether we should regret something because that's functionally emotional and not political or policy-based. And that's where you are able to make the same arguments and get the same strategic benefit without the optically bad thing of, oh, is it a value or is it a fact, is it a policy? I think there are times where you say, I already answered this. I think it's better don't answer it again, because judges will know. And you can just make the answer once and say, he says this a lot, but here's just the one response I'm able to give. That one thing consider doing when you're writing speeches is instead of the way you would in an American format where they see something and you write a response right next to it, consider writing your speech on a separate piece of paper that is tracking all the issues in the way it should, but that way you don't get bogged down in line by line because you know if something's repetitive. And that also makes sure your speech has a clear structure and outline. And then I think saving more time for this third argument about innovation and necessarily forcing it to be comparative. Not just why you get innovation, but why their side necessarily will. And it seems like there's the material there for it. Non-binding agreements don't provide the necessity and the compulsion to innovate. Second, I think you're doing the right thing with framing the debate about a question as opposed to the fact value stuff. One slight thing about the example is I was thinking maybe I finally would go to the gym if I promised such a big punishment that I can't just say oh, I can't go. So maybe that's just a choice and example that people might disagree about. But the second thing I'd say is it's good to paint the debate in those terms and consider doing that with political examples and examples more relevant to the topic as well. Giving the example of here's what China thinks because, or here's what the United States thinks because. And I think that's something just in general that could have been mentioned in this debate. You at least know U.S. politics. One thing is if it were a binding agreement, Republicans would have to ratify it in the Senate, which they obviously would have. And that's an example. And just fully fleshing that out, stories and examples relevant to the topic. Framing. And I think the last thing about developing countries, I think this is a huge area of the topic. And I think specifically for this that you want to save more time for it so you also can impact Europe and explain why the judge should care about empowerment. Because it's not just this is bad because Western imperialism is bad, which is definitely an element. But it's also there are practical ramifications for do we solve the climate change problem? And I think the strongest warrant was what came at the very end about how don't necessarily have the economies or innovations at the point where they can develop that. I think that's important. Also, another thing, just like everyone in debate does this, but you will be much better comparatively, is not generalizing amongst developing countries and recognizing that like the concerns facing China and India are a lot different from the concerns facing like fast-growing countries on the continent of Africa, like Nigeria and South Africa, and then compared to that, like a country like Uganda. So being able to explain that differentiation also adds a level of nuance to the argumentation for like small islands in the Pacific. Third proposition is, so I do think, based on how the round is going, that the structure of the speech is good in terms of breaking it down to non-binding, working versus binding, not working, or vice versa, depending on what side you're on. I think spending just a little bit too much time spent on this principle thing, or it should be something that's woven into the debate. And one thing you say, even at a POI or like a loud mutter during someone's speech, I don't remember, or both, is like, we agree that we can debate binding versus non-binding. That one thing is like, you are making arguments that are consistent with their side of the interpretation. It's just that when everyone on the team is saying that, oh, we're talking about that regrets, we're not talking about policies, that it's easy to lose sight of that. So like showing that you're debating this motion in multiple ways can help with that. I also think one thing you possibly could have considered if you're breaking the round down into questions is just making the Western imperialism thing an additional question that you answer. Oh, and I don't think you said the first question, or one of the question you're addressing is whether binding works and you do that. I don't think you ever got to non-binding doesn't work, or the transition wasn't clear enough. So either not making that distinction or fully separate. Third off, myth. So I think you're making persuasive arguments on this interpretational debate. I just think it's taking too much of your time. And I know that like the Danny joke is funny, and also Liz, like these jokes are funny, but again, they would also be in like an actual. No, this is an actual round. They'd be taken unprofessionally, and it just like undermines your credibility to an extent that like these aren't arguments that would be persuasive, like appealing to like what I was thinking when I said the motion. And you wouldn't do that if like the chief adjudicator at WSBC is judging round 9, and you're in a debate with like Australia about what the motion means. You're not going to be like, well, I know what you're thinking. I think bringing up the developing world stuff and specific to developing countries, keeping that relevant in debates and terms sort of falls out in the reply speech. And I think that's an element of the debate that's very relevant that you can address. And I think also, again, just clarifying some of the explanations you're using with examples. So like the Millennial Development Goals is like a good example of this, where you're first saying like pressure and agreeing on common goals can then lead us to get conclusions even if we don't enforce them. And then you add that example, explaining why that can clarify your thought. I think doing that with like the political capital stuff you're doing and giving specific examples of that is another way to like clarify and streamline your thinking. Then reply speech offered by Nick. I thought the speech was good as well. Other thing I'll say about the third op speech is right. They are making a response to they won't sign your agreement about China. How we wanted these goals. I think that's something that needs to be addressed earlier than the reply speech, because it is a response they're making that I don't think is important. Op reply. I think this is a good speech. I think just it's that this debate about whether it's I think you do this. You do a very good job of not making the debate about the motion take up too much time, which is exactly what I think you need to do. Because that it's just like becoming a little bit excessive at this point. I think breaking it down into whether binding solves and non-binding doesn't solve is good, but I also think there's the element of the developing world that'll add. And I think you can be going for fewer arguments in whether binding agreements solve. Just go for like 1 or 2 and fully question out. Good on the response to China, but like it is a good response, but it's coming too late in the debate. And then I think on non-binding solve, I think fully explaining the mechanism that you do a decent job of, and that's good. And then proposition to reply, I think it's just like a little bit too much on the motion where we need to get the full argumentation. And the next thing I think is that a lot of the speech is characterized as just responses to the op, but I think the first and foremost thing you want to be doing is reminding the judge of the offensive reasons to vote prop that were forgotten about in this debate and need to be remembered. But I also thought this was
Okay, so just quick note, I'm going to make it generic since you covered all the details on here. Josh, you need to work on your rhetoric. Where I caught it when you started talking, was when you were creating individual decisions, was why we had to vote upon this side of the house was looking back at the flow. First of all, go as far as the quantity zero partner drugs, okay? That's the first fatal move, and then your rhetoric at the top of the flow, you come up with this, crisis, or compounding crisis, then you go on midway through, you said we need action now. That concedes your ground at that point in time, and then after that statement, you said there's a new era of extinction, and then we go to a mass extinction scenario. So, and then you go to the KP, Canada, prosecutors, climate change, all that, and it starts to snowball, right, all the stats. That turns it into a policy round debate.
Yeah.
Then when you leave that and subject to interpretation, Nick takes it where Nick is sloppy with it, is he doesn't really give to me as far as you need to switch lenses and look at this in a policy instance because they failed to define regret, first of all, right? That's the first thing you should have said. That would have clarified it instead of going back and forth. That framework clarification of which lens the adjudicators should be looking at on whether it's just a fact or whether it's a policy lens, that should have been clarified by the end of this speech. It flowed on to Millen's speech. There is no way we should be starting at the middle of the debate on which lens. At that point in time, when you're looking at, which specifications of lenses that we should look at, guess what's going to happen to the judges? We're all confused and like, okay, all the argumentation then, the intention is actually taken away from, and we first have to deal with which lens of are we looking at for a policy lens, a fact lens, and then that's how we switch as adjudicators to look at it and then weigh the argumentation, right? So that's a priority issue. And when you tell us that you keep ping-ponging back on this issue, we don't know where to go, and then what do we do with arguments after this? And so we kind of, you cause judges to intervene or adjudicators to intervene at that point in time. So make sure all of that framework clarification comes, just only in the first speeches itself, okay? Nick, you should have just simply said, okay, first reason why is they failed to interpret it, regret, and then secondly, our reasonable interpretation is this. Because of what they said over here. They talk about this crisis, which meant they say we need action now. Therefore, the reasonable interpretation, the counter-interpretation that we offer to you was that regret would be this, therefore, here's the case. Okay? Otherwise, I felt 9 was a little excessive. It was quick. It was fast. Felt like it was a policy round. No explanations. Josh, quick thing before I forget. You started your second sub with a minute 20 left. That's kind of close. You can work on that time allocation. Organization as well, again. Nick, 151 left when you started your second sub. I didn't think you realized you caught yourself. Like, I need to switch gears. I only have 2 minutes left because you had that key pause there and I caught you. And then you're like, I need to talk about this and cover it. So it felt very, very rushed at the end. Obviously, you felt kind of into that. Will, again, we talked about as far as the fact debate. My argumentation with them was that if you contend that it is a fact debate and not a policy, why do you even engage in tacit consent with giving non-responses? Those responses go away at the point that they're looking at it and interpreting it incorrectly. That's what I thought about it, I guess.
Just out of curiosity, shouldn't we engage them on those grounds? Give me as a chance to bring that framing. Would it be bad for me to just concede it and see it?
I think we
like the only argument you're making are under their interpretation as opposed to like including arguments that would fall under their and keeping those from themselves.
Yeah, so not necessarily like disregard, but you still have to address them, but for the offense on the interpretation, and this is your spin, and this is why it's generally preferred that we look at it on here. That principle of obligation, that really should have been, that was the very final focus at the bottom of your speech. That should have been, once you refocus and reset the debate round, that should have been at the top of your speech to start off with and say, I would like to offer a point of clarification on how adjudicators should look at framing the debate at this point in time. Let's go back to the principle and let's go look back at the motion. That would have reset it, and then you should have reestablished a little bit of groundwork, push the offense from there. Julia, really strong again. Didn't buy the French fry thing. So sorry. Again, we are struggling with examples that are generic and can easily apply to that would have a nice general appeal to everyone, right? So you've got to make sure it's not with American slants, that it's a very clean analogy to it. But so we need more of a clarification of our analogy to examples on that. So I felt like I don't remember the name of this. Should we have explained to them also resetting the round based upon the info card?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Yeah.
We felt that if you needed to refocus the debate because it got messy, that we should have referenced, someone should have referenced back to the info card to restructure and reset the round with them and make it clear. So, yes?
Yeah, and just like this is what we know about this debate, we don't need to, it's just like, here's what we know.
Yeah. Julia, perception of audience is amazing. I would say that. Very, very amazing. I, again, cut the non-topical, cut the debate jargon, you know what you did wrong. I'm feeling fragmented at the very end when you say, well, why not what? Finish the question for me, specify the question of what I should be asking myself or what they should be answering later on. Liz, your delivery, I understand the importance of key pauses. You are key pausing at the wrong time, so it creates this weird pedantic race of speaking. It's really, I don't know, the key pauses are off. It's very relieving to me. Otherwise, I felt it was overall a very good speech, a very passionate speech. You were the most passionate speaker style-wise on that side of the house. Well, people was yelling to bring it up. And we had a problem on, actually, I added a point on the adjustments for Josh for his attempts at the POI. Millen was pretty decent on that, but you don't ask. He had 2 out of 3 questions were turn points that I thought were very important questions, Josh. You had that. Liz had 1 question that was a turning point. Millen, you had none, even though you did get 1 POI taken. So the attempts are there on this side of the house that was more active. Julia, you had 4. That's 4. 4. So you need to attempt more, please. Nick, you always. Nobody wants to deal with you. They want to squat you continuously. There's a reason for that. Because you are scary. Amit, you average right in the middle, so that's absolutely fine. Amit, beautiful, passionate speech. That's the level I would like to continuously see you at. Nick, there is something different about your delivery this time around. I cannot put my finger upon it. It is not me. It is not charismatic in any way.
Oh no. I thought I could fix that.
I'm not blown away, I'm not amazed. There is something flat about delivery. Don't confuse volume and intensity of volume as style point. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. chance to force the other team to engage with some of your own material. So you don't just want to, it's not just like ask a cross-ex question at a weak point, though sometimes it is, but it's also like, here's something you haven't responded to that I'm going to give you a chance to respond to your best material. And when you give us the response, we are going to take that response and decimate it so that we definitely win the round on the side.
Watch the timing of when you pop up as well. I really think it's critical. I like it when you don't pop up right at 7 8 those people off. But when they after that person, they first people off, and we're not doing 3 at a time. Who's the strongest? We should analyze. Ask them who the reply speaker is. That's the person where you stand 3 at a time. I think that's the person to pick up. You know, as the reply speaker. And we gotta find out who that person is, and then stand 1 at a time. Let's do 2 at a time. But you know, yeah. Make sure you're getting that in there.
And write them down.
Yeah.
I didn't have to drag it out.
I have 3 comments. I won't, I agree with a lot of what was said, before. I think, Danny is an excellent, and extremely comprehensive RFD. 3 things that, kind of stuck out to me throughout the debate. 1, I was very hungry for background information on the terrorist assignment agreement. Yeah. And I realized that too, where I was kind of like, well, wait, are we talking about what happened like a month ago? You know, or what is occurring here, right? Like never, you know, I'm someone who, you know, is familiar with and reads the news, and I was kind of like, what exactly are we talking about here? You know, in terms of the context. So I think to echo what Danny had said about comparing, you know, to the status quo, why is it that you regret? And what is not happening right now that needs to happen would have been so crucial to my understanding. So that's 1. And then if, you know, if they hadn't given kind of background information, I would have loved for you to have said, well, here's why it didn't work, and we don't regret, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, 2, I was starting in this debate just to compare it to the debate that I watched last night, for example. And we've already talked about that too. Not really examples of prior agreements, like we had a few, like Kyoto, we discussed, you discussed a lot, but examples of other agreements or enforcement mechanisms that don't necessarily deal with climate, but have been examples either of like international cooperation or like not. It was funny when this isn't necessarily an example of like international cooperation, but more of like a pledge to show intent. When people were talking about Bill and Melinda Gates, my initial thought was, oh, that's interesting because they're members of the billionaire club who have pledged to give away a certain amount of their money, and then like several billionaires around the world have also signed on to that pledge, but it's not like legally enforcing or anything. So I said, that's kind of had like a domino effect, but that probably is not relevant to the resolution, but I was hungry for, okay, other examples of, you know, what you exempted with the French fries, which definitely succeeded in making me hungry. But yeah, so more examples, more analogies. And then 3, yeah, this perception that occurred in this round. I don't think that the 3 of you were loud and commanding, and that is excellent, awesome. And when you are not as loud and dominating, I don't know if this is considered proper or not, but I know Milan, you pointed out like how loud the opposition speech was, like don't necessarily listen to how loud it was. I almost wanted you to go a step further and say don't listen to the substance if it's irrelevant or if it doesn't pertain to the claim. You know, that would be a little way if you're not as loud or you don't have as much of a command of the room, maybe to point out that difference and acknowledge, no, don't let these theatrics, not saying it was theatrics, but like don't let these theatrics distract from the substance and the actual discussion in this debate. When we could point that out. I also thought to echo comments like body language perception, the 3 of you were a little slouched during the middle, kind of like of their speeches, and so I look over here and you were not, like you were very engaged, and that just might have been like the time at which I looked up, but yeah, I would echo the perception just of, and I would say that was more towards like the middle